And you talk about the 10,000-hour rule, that it's not just a matter of, well, this person's a genius, this person has an amazing ability. It is actual practice and hard work.
You know, so a group of really brilliant psychologists in the field of expertise research have sat down and tried to figure out how long do you have to work at something before you become really good, right? And the answer seems to be, it's an extraordinarily consistent answer in an incredible number of fields, and that is you need to have practiced, to have apprenticed for 10,000 hours before you get good. So every great classical composer, without exception, composes for at least 10 years before they write their masterwork.
Mozart, 10?
Mozart is composing at 11, but he's composing garbage at 11. I mean, he doesn't produce something great until he's 22 or 23. Concerto number 9, I think, 271. If I asked you, how long did it take you when you were doing this job before you felt comfortable and good at what you were doing?
10 years at least.
10 years, yeah. Same with me. I mean, it's an incredibly consistent finding, and it's really important because it says that we are far too impatient with people. When we assess whether someone has got what it takes to do a certain job, we always want to make that assessment after 6 months or a year, and that's ridiculous, you know? The kinds of jobs we have people do today are sufficiently complex that they require a long time to reach mastery. And what we should be doing is setting up institutions and structures that allow people to spend the time and effort to reach mastery, not judging them prematurely.
What is the takeaway? What's the lesson for people who want to be more successful? I mean, what is, in some ways, it's good news that they don't have to be geniuses.
Yeah, although I've been, you know, I'm very anxious that this book not be seen as a self-help book, but be seen as a kind of community help book. Because lots of the things, what I really want people to do is start thinking about how can we as a society build institutions that provide opportunities to work hard.
It's a fascinating book, Outliers. Malcolm, thanks.
Thank you very much.
An outlier, if you do some sort of scientific experiment, there's this thing out there that is sort of this aberration that is way off the charts, and that's an outlier, right?
Yes, that's right.
Okay, so let's talk about some outliers. One of the examples of success you use in the book are the Beatles.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Tell the story of the Beatles and why they defy the norms and why they were as successful as they were.
Well, I was really taken by this, what happened to them before they came to America. You know, they come here in '64 and it's the Beatles invasion. Explode. But before they came, they were the house band in a strip club in Hamburg, Germany.
Right.
And they would play 8-hour sets 7 days a week for months at a stretch.
Sure.
And the idea there is that it was that we think of them as these geniuses who just come out of nowhere and who are naturally brilliant, but in fact they put in an apprenticeship of thousands of hours.
These overnight successes aren't overnight successes at all.
Yeah, that's one of the big themes of the book, actually, is that we sometimes look at people and we think that they must have this great innate talent, and we forget the enormous amount of work that went into to what looks like genius. There's a principle I talk about in the book called the 10,000-hour rule, which says that in a wide variety of disciplines, from being a good doctor to being a great golfer, or it doesn't matter really what it is, it looks like we need to spend 10,000 hours practicing before we get good.
Right.
So there's never been a great piece of classical music composed by someone who hasn't spent 10,000 hours first.
Because you write about Mozart, and everybody talks about Mozart composing as a little kid, but he didn't really compose anything anybody cared about until he was what?
23, at which point he'd been composing for over 10 years.
So it really, really does make sense.
I'm uninterested in that topic.
Which one? Well, the relationship between gift and practice?
No, I'm uninterested in natural gifts. I know they exist, and I know there's such a thing as talent,
but it's
blah,
not
blah,
fun.
blah. But I just feel like, so what, right? Because there are people, I mean, I always think of, you're a basketball fan, I always think of Derek Coleman.
Yes.
I remember chatting with a guy who worked for the Sixers, and he said, you have to understand that Derek Coleman was the most gifted man ever to set foot on a basketball court. He said, you've heard a million other names. Nobody was as good as Derek. And like, who has heard today, who puts Derek Coleman up there in the pantheon? No one. He didn't want to work. He had bad habits. He had a bad attitude. I mean, so what? Give me somebody who wants to go to practice in the morning and who wants to try in games, and I'll want to celebrate him. When you put forth effort, you get reward. When you throw your heart and mind and soul into something, you get something back. Now, in my book, I call that notion, that belief,
that effort brings reward, meaningful work. And when you look at the lives of people who are really successful, what you see over and over again is this idea of meaningful work is embedded in their consciousness. You know, I tell a story in the book of the Beatles. Everybody knows about the Beatles. They come here in 1964 and the British invasion. The most interesting thing about the Beatles is what happened to them before they came to America. In the 1960 and 1959, when they were just kids, they were invited to go to Hamburg in Germany to be the house band at a strip club. And they went there and they stayed there for months on end. And 7 days a week, they played 8-hour sets, night after night in this strip club, right? And over the course of that extraordinary crucible, that experience of playing, they taught themselves how to be a great band, right? In fact, we think now that by the time the Beatles came to America, they had played together as a live band 1,200 times. We could go to all of the clubs on Friday night in San Francisco where all the promising young bands are playing. I submit to you, you would not find a single band that has played together 1,200 times, right? Just doesn't happen. So what made the Beatles special? What made them special is that they were willing to play together 1,200 times, willing to play 8-hour sets 7 nights a week, 4 months at a stretch. And why were they willing? Because they believed in the notion of meaningful work. They had an opportunity to throw their heart and mind into something and get something back. And that made all the difference in the world.
And to my annoyance, some reviewers of my book have accused me of being a cultural determinist. In fact, I'm the opposite. So the culture that we come from is only deterministic of our behavior if we choose to ignore it, right? If you never address, so the chapter that I was talking about in my talk, the plane crash chapter, it's really about Korean Air and how Korean Air goes from being an airline that almost gets pushed out of business because it has so many plane crashes, to being one of the, what is now today, one of the premier airlines in the world. And they transform themselves over the last 10 years precisely because they say, they decide at long last to confront their cultural legacy and deal with it. And what they discover is if they are honest and open about the fact that in this particular instance, the cockpit, acting like you're a Korean is not a good idea, then you can change it. And they do. They take that airline from literally, it was this close to not existing anymore. And it is now an absolutely world-class airline. And what they showed, and I continue this theme in the second half of the book, is once we can talk about and confront culture, we can change culture. We're not prisoners of it. We're only prisoners of it if we pretend it doesn't exist. I had a conversation a couple weeks ago. I was giving a talk, and I was seated next to a guy who ran a regional bank in Akron, Ohio. And I said to him, I was talking about his business, how's your business, your banking business? He says, oh, we're fine. In fact, we're more than fine. We're about to buy a big bank in Chicago. I said, why are you fine and no one else is? And he was an older man. He was probably in his late 60s. And he said, I've been through this 3 times before. And what I suspect, we sort of talked a bit, and I suspect that he got humbled 25 years ago, or in the early 70s or late 70s, and never forgot that lesson. And it's that kind of, it is in times like that we understand why experience and learning from experience is so important. You know, it's more than simply, that word is not a kind of meaningless triviality. Experience matters because there's certain kinds of things that you only learn when you've been humbled, right? You can't just explain to a 28-year-old things are going to get bad. It's not going to sink in. But to this man I was speaking to, who saw it firsthand and dealt with it, and I'm sure went through all manner of crises before, it's a lesson that he kept with him. Colin Powell, before the Iraq War, he was the in-house skeptic. Why? Because he'd been through Vietnam. In a very first-hand way, in a way that many of the other decision-makers had not, and had never forgotten those lessons. So there's another sort of case of someone who appropriately was humbled and learned from experience. And you've got to have people like that around.
Is there a sports gene or a body type? Is there?
There absolutely are sports genes, and in fact, no single gene, but what we're learning, so just as kind of the medical genetics revolution showed that no two people respond to any drug the same way because of differences in their genes, we're finding the same thing for sports. So no two people respond to any training regimen the same way because their improvement is mediated by their genes. So we're finding that really people's biology is very specifically set up to profit from certain types of athletic training.
Epstein debunks a notion many parents have long believed, which is that if you start your kids in a particular sport at a young age, they stand a better chance at excelling at it later on. It's called early specialization.
I do think parents think when they look at their kids and they think, Johnny's going to be a football player, let's start him when he's 4 years old. Is there value in that?
So far the science, and there's more of it coming, shows that early hyper-specialization is not the normal route to elite athletic status. In fact, if you look at eventual elites versus eventual sub-elites, when they're kids, the elites actually practice less in their eventual sport.
From Victoria, British Columbia, number 11, Steve Nash.
So Steve Nash actually exemplifies what the most typical pattern to elite athlete status is, which is through about age 12, he had a sports sampling period, played a variety of things, wanted to be a pro soccer player, didn't get his first basketball until age 13, 8 years behind me, right? Obviously did not hinder his skill development as he became, one of the most skilled basketball players of all time.
Then there's the so-called 10,000-hour theory, which is that if you practice and practice and practice for 10,000 hours, you'll be a star. Lots of people believe that too, not Epstein.
You talk about training, and a term that has had a lot of traction lately is this whole 10,000-hour rule.
Yeah.
Is there value in that? Does that can you practice at something for 10,000 hours and then be that athlete?
No, so that idea that 10,000 hours of practice will make anyone an expert in anything, no, there's no validity to that idea. If the idea is just that a lot of practice and quality practice matters, absolutely, that's correct. But that's not controversial, right? This 10,000 hours comes from a tiny study of violinists who were so highly pre-screened they'd already gained admission to a world-famous music academy, right? This would be like setting up a study trying to look at basketball skill by using only NBA centers, noticing they'd practiced a lot and saying that's the only thing that got them where they are, not practice plus 7 feet tall, right? So absolutely, copious amounts of practice is important, but genes are important too, and finding the spot where you can make people the most successful with practice is really important.
Epstein notes there are other applications for genes beyond how they shape the athlete you are or are not. He says testing of genes may reveal something else.
You've hinted at it. So is there like good gene testing or DNA testing, or like what can be done?
So what I think is one of the most important potential tests that's being mostly overlooked is the test for a gene called ApoE4, a gene variant that actually predisposes people to not recovering well from concussions, for example. So these people, if they're in car accidents, they're more likely to die, to have brain bleeding, bruising, less success with rehab. And this is a huge conversation in hockey and in football now. And we know these people just have more trouble recovering from concussions, more likely to have permanent damage. Now that's something that you might actually want to know, even though it's just statistical risk information.
And though Epstein's research focuses on human athletes, he says he learned a real lesson from four-legged runners, a key genetic trait when it comes to sports.
In your book, you talk about the Iditarod dog race and desire, and the desire in animal. We're animals, that's a part of it. How does that play into who becomes elite athletes?
Yeah, so this is really interesting. So I knew when I was looking at the book that physical activity, training, alters our dopamine system, the pleasure and reward system in the brain. What I didn't know is that scientists who study this know full well that the reverse is true. Differences in our dopamine system setup make some people have sort of a compulsive drive to move, to be physically active, to feel rewarded for that. And that's actually what Iditarod dogs are bred for, right? Their speed maxed out years ago. Now the breeders breed them for the desire to continue to run and to do things like to continue to eat whenever they get a chance to. And some of these dopamine genes that you see in dogs and that we can model in mice are in humans also.
So in other words, does that mean like for you know, these dogs that just want to get out there and race, that same desire is in some kids, like young Wayne Gretzky just wanted to get out there because he knew he was born to be that guy.
Yeah, in fact, those cases like Wayne Gretzky or Tiger Woods, right, where clearly their parents facilitated a huge amount of practice, but the evidence is that they showed this desire that the adult then responds to by forming the environment, and that's how that usually happens. I mean, one of my favorite interviews from the book was actually on this topic with Pam Reed, a legendary ultramarathoner. And Pam, when I interviewed her, the day before she had just finished the national championship in Ironman triathlon in New York, qualified for Worlds in her 50s, and her flight out of LaGuardia Airport was delayed, and she gets so antsy sitting still, she'd stashed her bags and was running laps around the parking structure while I was interviewing her, the day after the Ironman national championships. You know, that's pretty extreme, but those people are out there.
Super interesting. Thanks, David.
Thank you.
Appreciate it.
The Olympic motto is Citius Altius Fortius, faster, higher, stronger. And athletes have fulfilled that motto rapidly. The winner of the 2012 Olympic marathon ran 2 hours and 8 minutes. Had he been racing against the winner of the 1904 Olympic marathon, he would have won by nearly an hour and a half. Now, we all have this feeling that we're somehow just getting better as a human race, inexorably progressing. But it's not like we've evolved into a new species in a century. So, what's going on here? I want to take a look at what's really behind this march of athletic progress. In 1936, Jesse Owens held the world record in the 100 meters. Had Jesse Owens been racing last year in the World Championships of the 100 meters, when Jamaican sprinter Usain Bolt finished, Owens would have still had 14 feet to go. That's a lot in sprinterland. To give you a sense of how much it is, I want to share with you a demonstration conceived by sports scientist Ross Tucker. Now, picture the stadium last year at the World Championships of the 100 meters. Thousands of fans waiting with bated breath to see Usain Bolt, the fastest man in history. Flashbulbs popping as the 9 fastest men in the world coil themselves into their blocks. And I want you to pretend that Jesse Owens is in that race. Now close your eyes for a second and picture the race. Bang! The gun goes off. An American sprinter jumps out to the front. Usain Bolt starts to catch him. Usain Bolt passes him, and as the runners come to the finish, you'll hear a beep as each man crosses the line. That's the entire finish of the race. You can open your eyes now. That first beep was Usain Bolt. That last beep was Jesse Owens. Listen to it again. When you think of it like that, it's not that big a difference, is it? And then consider that Usain Bolt started by propelling himself out of blocks, down a specially fabricated carpet, designed to allow him to travel as fast as humanly possible. Jesse Owens, on the other hand, ran on cinders, the ash from burnt wood, and that soft surface stole far more energy from his legs as he ran. Rather than blocks, Jesse Owens had a gardening trowel that he had to use to dig holes in the cinders to start from. Biomechanical analysis of the speed of Owens' joints shows that had he been running on the same surface as Bolt, he wouldn't have been 14 feet behind. He would have been within 1 stride. Rather than the last beep, Owens would have been the second beep. Listen to it again. That's the difference track surface technology has made, and it's done it throughout the running world. Consider a longer event. In 1954, Sir Roger Bannister became the first man to run under 4 minutes in the mile. Nowadays, college kids do that every year. On rare occasions, a high school kid does it. As of the end of last year, 1,314 men had run under 4 minutes in the mile. But like Jesse Owens, Sir Roger Bannister ran on soft cinders that stole far more energy from his legs than the synthetic tracks of today. So I consulted biomechanics experts to find out how much slower it is to run on cinders than synthetic tracks, and their consensus was that it's 1.5% slower. So if you apply a 1.5% slowdown conversion to every man who ran his sub-4 mile on a synthetic track, this is what happens. Only 530 are left. If you look at it from that perspective, fewer than 10 new men per decade have joined the sub-4 mile club since Sir Roger Bannister. Now, 530 is a lot more than 1, right? And that's partly because there are many more people training today and they're training more intelligently. Even college kids are professional in their training compared to Sir Roger Bannister, who trained for 45 minutes at a time while he ditched gynecology lectures in med school. And that guy who won the 1904 Olympic marathon in 3.5 hours, that guy was drinking rat poison and brandy while he ran along the course. That was his idea of a performance-enhancing drug. Clearly, athletes have gotten more savvy about performance-enhancing drugs as well. And that's made a difference in some sports at some times, but technology has made a difference in all sports, from faster skis to lighter shoes. Take a look at the record for the 100-meter freestyle swim. The record is always trending downward, but it's punctuated by these steep cliffs. This first cliff in 1956 is the introduction of the flip turn. Rather than stopping and turning around, athletes could somersault under the water and get going right away in the opposite direction. This second cliff, the introduction of gutters on the side of the pool that allows water to splash off rather than becoming turbulence that impedes the swimmers as they race. This final cliff, the introduction of full body and low friction swimsuits. Throughout sports, technology has changed the face of performance. In 1972, Eddie Merckx set the record for the longest distance cycled in 1 hour at 30 miles, 3,774 feet. Now, that record improved and improved as bicycles improved and became more aerodynamic, all the way until 1996, when it was set at 35 miles, 1,531 feet, nearly 5 miles farther than Eddie Merckx cycled in 1972. But then in 2000, the International Cycling Union decreed that anyone who wanted to hold that record had to do so with essentially the same equipment that Eddie Merckx used in 1972. Where does the record stand today? 30 miles, 4,657 feet. A grand total of 883 feet farther than Eddie Merckx cycled more than 4 decades ago. Essentially, the entire improvement in this record was due to technology. Still, technology isn't the only thing pushing athletes forward. While indeed we haven't evolved into a new species in a century, the gene pool within competitive sports most certainly has changed. In the early half of the 20th century, physical education instructors and coaches had the idea that the average body type was the best for all athletic endeavors. Medium height, medium weight, no matter the sport. And this showed in athletes' bodies. In the 1920s, the average elite high jumper and average elite shot putter were the same exact size. But as that idea started to fade away, as sports scientists and coaches realized that rather than the average body type, you want highly specialized bodies that fit into certain athletic niches. A form of artificial selection took place, a self-sorting for bodies that fit certain sports. And athletes' bodies became more different from one another. Today, rather than the same size as the average elite high jumper, the average elite shot putter is 2.5 inches taller and 130 pounds heavier. And this happened throughout the sports world. In fact, if you plot on a height versus mass graph one data point for each of 24 sports in the first half of the 20th century, it looks like this. There's some dispersal, but it's kind of grouped around that average body type. Then that idea started to go away, and at the same time, digital technology, first radio, then television and the internet, gave millions, or in some cases billions, of people a ticket to consume elite sports performance. The financial incentives and fame and glory afforded elite athletes skyrocketed, and it tipped toward the tiny upper echelon of performance. It accelerated the artificial selection for specialized bodies. And if you plot a data point for these same 24 sports today, it looks like this. The athletes' bodies have gotten much more different from one another. And because this chart looks like the charts that show the expanding universe, with the galaxies flying away from one another, the scientists who discovered it call it the Big Bang of body types. In sports where height is prized, like basketball, the tall athletes got taller. In 1983, the National Basketball Association signed a groundbreaking agreement, making players partners in the league, entitled to shares of ticket revenues and television contracts. Suddenly, anybody who could be an NBA player wanted to be, and teams started scouring the globe for the bodies that could help them win championships. Almost overnight, the proportion of men in the NBA who are at least 7 feet tall doubled to 10%. Today, 1 in 10 men in the NBA are at least 7 feet tall. But a 7-foot-tall man is incredibly rare in the general population. So rare that if you know an American man between the ages of 20 and 40 who's at least 7 feet tall, there's a 17% chance he's in the NBA right now. That is, find 6 honest 7-footers, 1 is in the NBA right now. And that's not the only way that NBA players' bodies are unique. This is Leonardo da Vinci's Vitruvian Man, the ideal proportions, with arm span equal to height. My arm span is exactly equal to my height. Yours is probably very nearly so, but not the average NBA player. The average NBA player is a shade under 6'7", with arms that are 7 feet long. Not only are NBA players ridiculously tall, they are ludicrously long. Had Leonardo wanted to draw the Vitruvian NBA player, he would have needed a rectangle and an ellipse, not a circle and a square. So in sports where large size is prized, the large athletes have gotten larger. Conversely, in sports where diminutive stature is an advantage, the small athletes got smaller. The average elite female gymnast shrunk from 5'3" to 4'9" on average over the last 30 years. All the better for their power to weight ratio and for spinning in the air. And while the large got larger and the small got smaller, the weird got weirder. The average length of the forearm of a water polo player in relation to their total arm got longer. All the better for a forceful throwing whip. As the large got larger, small got smaller, and the weird weirder. In swimming, the ideal body type is a long torso and short legs. It's like the long hull of a canoe for speed over the water. And the opposite is advantageous in running. You want long legs and a short torso. And this shows in athletes' bodies today. Here you see Michael Phelps, the greatest swimmer in history, standing next to Hicham El Guerrouj, the world record holder in the mile. These men are 7 inches different in height. But because of the body types advantaged in their sports, they wear the same length pants. 7 inches difference in height, these men have the same length legs. Now, in some cases, the search for bodies that could push athletic performance forward ended up introducing into the competitive world populations of people that weren't previously competing at all, like Kenyan distance runners. But we think of Kenyans as being great marathoners. Kenyans think of the Kalenjin tribe as being great marathoners. The Kalenjin make up just 12% of the Kenyan population, but the vast majority of elite runners. And they happen on average to have a certain unique physiology. Legs that are very long and very thin at their extremity. And this is because they have their ancestry at very low latitude in a very hot and dry climate. And an evolutionary adaptation to that is limbs that are very long and very thin at the extremity for cooling purposes. It's the same reason that a radiator has long coils, to increase surface area compared to volume to let heat out. And because the leg is like a pendulum, the longer and thinner it is at the extremity, the more energy efficient it is to swing. To put Kalenjin running success in perspective, consider that 17 American men in history have run faster than 2 hours and 10 minutes in the marathon. That's a 4 minute and 58 second per mile pace. 32 Kalenjin men did that last October. That's from a source population the size of metropolitan Atlanta. Still, even changing technology and the changing gene pool in sports don't account for all of the changes in performance. Athletes have a different mindset than they once did. Have you ever seen in a movie when someone gets an electrical shock and they're thrown across a room? There's no explosion there. What's happening when that happens is that the electrical impulse is causing all of their muscle fibers to twitch at once, and they're throwing themselves across the room. They're essentially jumping. That's the power that's contained in the human body. But normally we can't access nearly all of it. Our brain acts as a limiter, preventing us from accessing all of our physical resources because we might hurt ourselves, tearing tendons or ligaments. But the more we learn about how that limiter functions, the more we learn how we can push it back just a bit. In some cases, by convincing the brain that the body won't be in mortal danger by pushing harder. Endurance and ultra-endurance sports serve as a great example. Ultra-endurance was once thought to be harmful to human health. But now we realize that we have all these traits that are perfect for ultra-endurance. No body fur and a glut of sweat glands that keep us cool while running. Narrow waists and long legs compared to our frames. Large surface area of joints for shock absorption. We have an arch in our foot that acts like a spring. Short toes that are better for pushing off than for grasping tree limbs. And when we run, we can turn our torso and our shoulders like this while keeping our head straight. Our primate cousins can't do that. They have to run like this. And we have big old butt muscles that keep us upright while running. Have you ever looked at an ape's butt? They have no buns because they don't run upright. And as athletes have realized that we're perfectly suited for ultra-endurance, they've taken on feats that would have been unthinkable before. Athletes like Spanish endurance racer Kilian Jornet. Here's Kilian running up the Matterhorn with a sweatshirt there tied around his waist. It's so steep he can't even run here. He's pulling up on a rope. This is a vertical ascent of more than 8,000 feet, and Kilian went up and down in under 3 hours. Amazing. And talented though he is, Kilian is not a physiological freak. Now that he has done this, other athletes will follow, just as other athletes followed after Sir Roger Bannister ran under 4 minutes in the mile. Changing technology, changing genes, and a changing mindset. Innovation in sports, whether that's new track surfaces or new swimming techniques, the democratization of sport, the spread to new bodies and to new populations around the world, and imagination in sport, an understanding of what the human body is truly capable of, have conspired to make athletes stronger, faster, bolder, and better than ever. Thank you very much. Right? The difference between legendary and anonymity in elite sports is usually less than 1%, usually about 0.5% of the difference in performance. That, in this race, was the difference between Usain Bolt and a guy that nobody in this room other than me has probably ever heard of. So just to give you a sense again, I'll play that whole race again. Bang, the gun goes off. An American jumps out to the front. Usain Bolt starts to catch him. He starts to pull away, and they come to the line. This will be the entire finish of the race. That's it. That's the whole race, start to finish. That last beep is where the Olympic winner in 1936 would have been. That's how small the difference really is. And so the key for sports, while they've been gathering all of this data, is really figuring out how to find that 0.5% difference in the data. So I won't go too much into sort of the misapplication of data in sports that happens all the time, but I want to give an example of one successful application, very simple application where British UK Athletics, which is sort of the sports body in Great Britain that had a big increase in funding when London won the Summer Olympics last year, how they decided to apply some sports science. Rather than just continuing to gather huge amounts of data, which is what most sports bodies were doing, they decided first to try to figure out very simply what they could actually affect before they just gathered tons of data. And to do that, they wanted to look at an event where they thought they could win some more medals. And these were the field events in track where they felt they could win more medals. So they looked at shot put, right? And they said, well, what determines how far the shot goes? And they narrowed it down to 3 things that determine how far the shot goes. The first being the height, the velocity of the release of the shot being one. Another being the release height, so how far above the thrower's head his hand is when he releases the shot. And finally, the angle, the release angle. So those 3 things are essentially all there is to shot put. And they said, well, let's look at this in a competition between the 2 best people in the world. So they went and looked at the 2007 World Championships, where the 2 best shot putters were competing, and said, well, let's see what the difference between them was. So here are those 2 men. The gold medal winner was a man named Reese Hoffa, who threw 72 feet and 4 inches. The silver medalist was a Dartmouth grad named Adam Nelson, 70 feet and 11 inches. And so UK Athletics decided to look at those parameters they had narrowed it down to. And they said, well, okay, let's look at height. Oh, Adam Nelson, the guy who got silver, actually released from a higher point. So he had an advantage there. So far, so good for him. He actually released faster, too. So he had the advantage of height. He had the velocity advantage. But what about that third variable, the angle of release? In this case, Reese Hoffa released the shot at 1.5 degrees higher, and that made the difference between gold and silver, right? So let's say if Adam Nelson had tweaked his release a little bit. If he had tweaked his release such that instead of throwing at 31.5 degrees, he'd thrown 1 degree higher. Instead of 70 feet and 11 inches, he would have thrown 72 feet, 4.5 inches, and he would have been the gold medalist instead of the silver medalist. And in a sport like shot put, the difference between winning gold and silver, in this case it would have been a 1/2 inch, is the difference between essentially being able to make a living at it and having to have an off-season job. There's only space at the top for sponsorship in these kind of sports. So this tiny difference can alchemize silver into gold. And so when UK Athletics realized this, they said, you know what, maybe we can apply this to other sports. What can we actually change? And they said, let's look at long jump. So UK Athletics hired a PhD biomechanist, of which there are precious few in the world, and created a new job title called Horizontal Jumps Specialist. All this guy's job was to do was to watch long jumpers over and over and over and try to decide what he could change. So the biomechanist decided that it's pretty similar to shot put. So the speed of approach down the runway is factor 1. The amount of force that the jumper puts into the jumping board is factor 2. And factor 3 is the jump angle. He very quickly realized that speed is incredibly difficult to coach, so forget about that. Force into the board, you can coach, but at that level, you're pretty much where you are, so that's really hard. Angle, he could change. The jump angle, he could change. So all he did was work with the best jumper in England named Greg Rutherford to improve his jump angle over and over and over. And what happened, just to heighten it a little bit, the ideal jump angle for long jumpers is about 23 degrees. And so, come the Olympics, Greg Rutherford did not have not even close to the fastest approach to the jump, not even close to the most amount of force put into the board, but he jumped at precisely the right angle and won the gold medal. So what this horizontal jump specialist was able to do was essentially take a guy who was not one of the best athletes in his field in the world and win him a gold medal by figuring out, quite simply, what was important and what he could change. And it was applications like this that caused UK athletics, that caused Great Britain to have this incredible increase in medals at their home Olympics. And so, of course, these kind of applications of sports science aren't the only thing, right? There's a lot that goes into the point before an athlete even gets to this case, and some of it you've probably heard of, right? Practice, 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 right? The old 10,000 hours rule. So who here has heard of the 10,000 hour rule? Most people, right? Who here has read the primary document from which it comes, the scientific study? 1, 2, 3, a couple? Yeah, so most people have not, and most people don't know that though it's applied very heavily in sports now, it actually comes from a tiny study of violinists. It just so happens that the man, Anders Ericsson, the psychologist who did the work that has been turned into the 10,000 hour rule, while we haven't been reading his primary sources, he has been reading the popular interpretations of the 10,000 hour rule. And he, just as of recently, posted a letter on his faculty webpage at Florida State, and I'll sort of let the title of it speak for itself in terms of how he feels about the portrayal of the 10,000 hour rule in popular media. It is the danger of delegating education to journalists. Yeah, no offense taken. So in my longer talk today, I'm going to really get into the background of the 10,000 hour rule and why this number 10,000 has been so destructive in sports, but just to highlight one of the problems. So first of all, this was, again, a study of a group of violinists, 10 of them, who had been already admitted to a world-famous music academy, right? So first off, this would be like doing a study of basketball skill, restricting it to NBA centers, noticing they'd practiced a lot, and concluding that's the only reason they got to the NBA, not practice plus being 7 feet tall. So that was one problem. Another was that it was an average and amazingly got published in a peer-reviewed journal without any measure of variance at all. Huge problem in sports science, lack of measures of variance. So to give an example of why that's problematic, rather than 10,000 hours, to reach international master status in chess, average number of hours of practice is 11,053. So it's an 11,053 hour rule, right? But some people make it in 3,000 hours. And some people are at 25,000 hours and still haven't made it. So you can call it an 11,053 hour rule, but what does that get you? So using the breadth of the sports science, I've sort of retitled the rule just a little bit to more accurately reflect the scientific literature and all manner of skill acquisition, and that is what I call the 10,000 hours plus or minus 10,000 hours rule. And I'll talk a lot, as I've given it away, I'll talk a lot more about it and why it has been dangerously applied in high-performance sports science in my later talk, so I hope to see some of you there. Thank you very much.
Top Dog, The Science of Winning and Losing. I've seen a lot of interviews about the book lately. Poe and Ashley, the critics say it's about competition. I'm going to set it out for me. The book is about why we must understand a basic drive of human behavior. Call it the competitive spirit. In your first or second chapter, you call it aritas. What is aritas? Do you want to start? Or?
Well, it's interesting when we were talking about competition, we would even say we were working on a book about competition and people say, oh, is it good or bad? And we were just like, no, it is. Competition is just part of our lives that we have to deal with. But it was interesting. I think we don't have any problem with President Obama saying the nation needs to be more competitive. Right. Even if you don't like Obama, you still agree with that sentence, right? But when we apply it to people, it's a little more complicated, right? Michael Phelps can be competitive, but your girlfriend playing out in board games or someone in a parking space, not so much. So what we did is we actually were looking for the ancient Greeks were the first society to celebrate competition. And they actually had the greatest virtue was called aratos. And aratos is, I think, mistranslated often to be excellence. But it's really about how competition is, through competition, you learn to do your very best. It teaches you how to have strategies, to have leadership. It teaches you to use everything you've been learning and problem solving and to have character. So the Greeks actually thought the competitive experience taught morality, whereas we right now, I think, are sort of worried that it leads to immoral behavior, and it just doesn't.
Poe, you rows upon rows of self-help books. What distinguishes your book, and I want to look in the camera when I say this, is that your findings, your theses, your perceptions are based upon empirical data. It's kind of new. I want to be clear on this. Both of you wrote a book on nurture shock, and you were involved in that debate about self-esteem and what do you tell your kids, and then you have people like Malcolm Gladwell writing about outliers and saying you need 10,000 hours of experience to practice to be good. Is that where the book started, the idea in your head that there's something missing about human behavior? We have to address competition?
Well, yes. I mean, when we were talking about nurture shock, people were telling...
I'm belaboring this point because I want the audience to understand.
Yeah. Right. You know, we would hear all the time, you know, my kid's soccer team doesn't keep score. But we were like, but the kids
know
keep
it.
score. Right.
Right.
And, you know, is it good to give everybody trophies? Well, no. The research says it's not good to give everybody trophies because it's an illusion. Some kids succeeded and want to be recognized, and some kids struggle and they want to be recognized that they may need help. Yeah. Not just reassured everything's wonderful.
More important was that even those who had, as Malcolm Gladwell had noted, 10 years of experience, you know, 10 years of competing in ballroom dancing competitions, they still had just as much stress pushing through their bodies as the skydivers did and as the novices did. And it turns out that it suggested to us that 10,000 hours in 10 years is not the secret to performing. That's the secret to just maybe getting good at the first place. But when you actually compete, you are going up against other people who also have 10,000 hours of experience. And if you haven't, they haven't either. I mean, really, none of us get to wait 10 years before we have to perform. We have to perform often in the very first few months before we're ever learning a new skill. And we wanted to know what makes someone good at that. What makes someone be able to, you know, handle it when the lights are on, the lights are bright, and people are watching.
Women take risks, but they take risks differently from men. Would you want to handle that one?
Well,
I love that.
I do too. But you know, it's interesting. I think in some ways it is an advantage to women. In some ways it's absolutely a disadvantage. It depends on the context. And what it turns out is, you know, because I had been told, as you know, growing up and you know, going to college and in my professional life, you know, women really aren't that competitive, and our strengths is coalition building.
They didn't go to my high school. That's okay.
Well, they didn't go to mine either, and I was like, "Who are you giving this book to? I'm really competitive. Are you telling me I'm a bad girl because I'm being competitive?" And the research, actually, neither of us really wanted to look at the gender research. I have to tell you, for me, it just made me angry. He was also thinking that it wasn't representative of the women he knew in his life, his mom, his wife, his daughter. And every time I saw, you know, women are less competitive, I just went crazy because I couldn't figure out what it was. But when we dove deeper into the research, what we found is that it turns out women are more calculating about whether or not they're going to win. And they decide whether or not they're going to compete based on that assessment. And they just refuse to waste time losing. Once they feel like, I'm going to win, they're in it, maybe even more than the men. But men have a lower standard in terms of what the requirements are for winning. So in contexts like politics, women's calculation about whether or not I'm going to, you know, win is going to hurt their careers. You know, research with Sarah Fulton, a researcher at Texas A&M, she found that men who were, you know, at the state legislature and even interested about Congress said, yeah, I'm going to run. And women said, I'm only going to run if I think I'm going to win. But incumbents win. You know, incumbents win 95% of the time. Most women are going to say, no, I'm not going to do that. The big election success last November, new highs in women's participation, still only 18%. only 4 women filled out the forms out of the entire country saying, I want to run for governor. They weren't actually running, they didn't make it for 4 women, that's it. But in another context, like Wall Street, women are actually better financial analysts than men because they're looking at the odds of success. They want to be really sure that their numbers are accurate.
Oh, I saw. There's a lot in this book. One of my favorite, and this is an easy example, but you see Magic Johnson and Larry Bird. Larry Bird squirms when he sees the Boston Celtics going out there and saying, hey, how you doing? Love your game. You know, how's your mother and stuff like that. You do that after the game, and you write about that, don't you? In fact, I'm going to say,
yeah, very much.
It's called Tend and Befriend.
Yeah.
You want to talk about that, Poe?
Sure. So,
I love it.
So it's because we so see that today
yeah.
in today's NBA stars and the contrast. Or you see it also in baseball today. Players move around. At first base, they're always chatting each other up. You don't see the runner try to spike the first baseman. You know, they're all being friendly. And when they do that, when you tend and befriend your opponent, you diffuse your natural testosterone response to the moment.
Reading my mind.
Now, not just men. When we hear testosterone, people often think guys and muscles, right? We're talking about both men and women.
I want to hear Ashley talk about testosterone.
Okay, but both men and women have this response, and we're talking about its effect on the mind, your perception of the situation. And testosterone readies you to compete. And when you tend and befriend, you diffuse it, you knock it down. And in that sense, you become less ready to truly compete. Yeah. And so when we see something like Dwight Howard of the Lakers go out to center court and high-fiving all these guys on the other team and acting like they're his friends and tweeting them, he's only diffusing that very thing. And that's why you see Kobe Bryant, he's got that kind of like intense focus, and he does not being too friendly with everybody else, and that's why he comes through in the clutch. And that's Larry Bird had that, and he understood that you need to treat them as your enemy during the game. After the game, have a beer, whatever. But it's really undermining.
That's one of my colleagues.
There you go, head it, Davey! Who hasn't been this parent?
Nice pressure, Luke, good pressure!
Gushing platitudes like, you're so smart, or you played great at every turn.
Good.
Poe Bronson, who writes about child rearing, says he's guilty, but he's not alone.
85% of American parents think it's important to tell their kid they're smart, to praise them for their intelligence. Why? We want it to be an angel on their shoulder, riding along with them to give them confidence that when they approach challenges, their parents there to remind them, you're smart, you have what it takes, you can do this.
Bronson says he's trying to reform, and so should you. He says a decade of groundbreaking research suggests the wrong kind of praise can lead kids to lose self-confidence, not gain it, and actually perform worse in school, not better.
Kids become fixated on maintaining the image of being smart. They choose teachers and projects where they know they can get an A.
Stanford University professor Carol Dweck has tested thousands of elementary school kids across the country for the effect of praise on their performance. Her work is the basis for a chapter in Bronson's new book, Nurture Shock. So we asked Dweck and one of her graduate students to show us what she learned.
You want to find the piece that would go right here with this one. Exactly, yeah, it's number 8.
Watch what happens when these two, 9-year-old Mary and 10-year-old Jameson, are given a set of IQ puzzles.
Their experimental conditions were exactly the same, with one single distinction. Mary was praised for intelligence. She was said, you must be very smart.
You must be really smart at these problems.
And Jameson, the only thing different about him was he was told, you must have worked very hard on these problems.
You must have worked really hard on these problems. Yeah, I did.
And if you followed them after that point, what did we see? Mary began obsessing about whether she was smart and not smart.
What kind of problems would you like to work on next? Would you like problems that aren't too hard so you don't get many wrong?
Don't too hard.
And problems that are pretty easy so you'll do well? Problems that you're pretty good at so you can show that you're smart? Or problems that you'll learn from even if you won't look so smart?
problems that I'm pretty good at so I can show them smart.
Okay.
I am smart.
Yeah.
It made her psychologically vulnerable. Jamison had the opposite experience.
Problems that I'll learn a lot from me, even if I don't look so smart.
He'd been praised for his effort, and he wasn't afraid of challenges. He said, I want to work on the problems that I will learn a lot from, even if I don't look smart.
And it's crucial that a child learn not to be afraid of challenges. The latest research now tells us that mental challenges are what build intelligence. It has an actual physical effect on the brain.
So every time you challenge your brain, new connections are forming between neurons.
But it doesn't happen if you're not challenging yourself.
It only happens by challenging your brain.
Professor Dweck has developed this computer video to illustrate to kids the idea that the brain is like a muscle that you can build by exercising it.
It's a different kind of exercise you do for your brain, exploring new information, practicing skills, and learning new concepts.
That's not the only reason the right kind of praise is important. It also influences how kids do when they face adversity. Look what happens next when both kids are given a very difficult test. Mary scores an astonishing 6 right. Jamison only gets 3 correct. But the researcher gives both a discouraging report, and Mary starts to lose her confidence.
There are other people in my class that are smarter than me, too.
Jamison seems less flustered, though he actually didn't do as well as Mary.
Oh, you only got 3 right on these. That's a lot worse.
Yeah.
But undaunted, he moves on to the 3rd test and nails it.
All right, you got 9.
These ones look easier.
The surprise is Mary, who remember had done twice as well as Jamison on the previous test, but ends up doing worse than him on a final and easier test.
When she was given a test at the end, she crumbled, and she started to really have trouble.
The power of one line of praise.
Ooh, that's good, that's good.
American parents have a hard time giving bad news to their kids. At least that's the result of research conducted by Flori Ng with children and their mothers in Illinois and Hong Kong. The kids are all given a test. At a mid-break, each of their mothers is told her child had done poorly, whether the child had or not. Each mother is then allowed 5 minutes alone with her child.
The American moms walks into the room with her child and never mentions their score on the test.
You don't have to eat them now. We can take them home if you want, because we're going to drive through McDonald's or something.
And basically, we saw them completely ignoring their child's failure and not willing to help them.
She said you did really good on the test.
And if anything, praising them for their intelligence or don't worry, you're going to do great.
I only missed 2 out of one of the first session.
She said some kids miss a lot more than that.
The mothers in Hong Kong, by contrast, told that their child hadn't done very well, and they would sit down and they'd say, you didn't concentrate, let's sit down, let's work through the test.
And what happened when they continued the test?
They then took another test, identical. The American kids, because they had a little practice, did a little bit better. But the Chinese kids did 33% better, a whopping jump in their performance right after this little instruction period with their mothers.
So our idea that anything short of absolute loving, licking praise is cruel is just not proven out.
It's helpful to see that as American parents, we can be loving and affectionate and supportive at the same time as we are directing our child's attention to better strategies to improve and to learn.
It's better to do it right than to do it too fast.
Bronson says no parent is perfect, but if you can keep the wrong kind of praise to a minimum, under 25% of the time, he says, you're on the right track. But he admits, even for him, it's not easy.
When I first read Carol's research, I knew I was doing everything wrong all of a sudden. But it wasn't so easy to stop. You know, the first stage of withdrawal for me was that I stopped at home telling my children that they were so smart, they were so great. But we'd go out to these school events, and I'd hear all the other parents praising their children, I would fall off the wagon around other parents.
I'm gonna try to be like really mean, rotten coach, okay?
The praise junkie wasn't my child, it was me.
But there is no limit on one kind of support, something parents can repeat and repeat.
Telling your child you love them is something else. And you can tell your child you love them all you want.